Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mitra's webinar on creating value in a hyper-connected world. My name is Chinti Veerasinghe, and I am the CEO of Mitra Digital. I have two very interesting individuals joining me for this webinar today. Firstly, let me introduce you to Nuan Dias. Nuan is a Senior Director of API Architecture at WSO2. He's basically the main man behind WSO2's API product strategy and roadmap. And what's really interesting is that he is currently working on optimizing the developer experience. So it sounds like there's a lot of interesting things ahead of us from WSO2. He specializes in APIs, integration security, and is the co-author of the book Microservices Security in Action. Noan is also a member of the Open API Security Group and shares his knowledge and experience at numerous API and integration conferences around the world. He's an API enthusiast and an architect at heart, and loves to build software that makes people's lives safer and happier. Nuan, it's a pleasure to have you on our webinar.
Thanks, Chinti, and it's a pleasure to be here as well.
Great. Also joining me is one of our own, Ayesha Ansar, who is the solution lead for Mitra Digital's business. She's also a tech enthusiast and passionate about driving innovation to make a difference and building solutions that really matter. Ayesha has over a decade of experience in creating customer experiences solutions for a myriad of industries, ranging from record management, PFS, education, telco, healthcare, retail, logistics across the globe. Welcome, Ayesha, to the webinar.
Thank you, Chinti. It's lovely to be here with all of you folks.
All right. So let me start by setting a little bit of context. While a majority of the firms are helping businesses play catch up and on their digital journey, we at Mitra see a bigger opportunity to help our clients leapfrog in their digital journey, especially in the APAC region, with great opportunities ahead of us. Connectivity is really now part of our everyday lives from the moment we wake up to the minute we go to sleep, even while we sleep. All 7.7 billion of us are continuously connected to over 38 billion devices, whether it will be via your smartwatch or the 5.1 billion unique mobile phones users or smart cars. People are increasingly switched on. So this question is how far are we looking ahead and thinking about what this means to us, to our businesses, to our teams, to our societies? This convergence market is estimated to be around $100 trillion. So, what opportunities lie ahead of us at Mitra? We know that only by thinking about where we want to be tomorrow can we prompt the actions we need to do today. So, can you imagine a world where virtual reality will protect mental health? We provide precision medicine for everyone, or digital tech will help close the gender and wealth gap. If all of this sounds too futuristic, think again. We are closer than you think. As an example, the autonomous flying taxi named Volocopter that you see here on the picture has already been demonstrated in Dubai and has made several manned test flights in Singapore. It's a lot more quieter, cleaner, and a lot more sustainable than the usual helicopters and can be summoned simply with your smartphone. We believe that coupled with 5G, the autonomous version will use 5G to request permission to land, download flight data, or improve the performance and safety. In fact, a cargo version capable of carrying about 200 kilograms over 40 kilometers has already test flown in Singapore. And it's also staged a medical rescue mission in Germany. So, hyperconnected really means everything is talking to everyone or everything, person to machine, machine to machine. The beauty is the value of this network grows exponentially as a number of people and things get connected into the network. Now, this is not without risks. Obviously, communicating over digital networks can obviously have its own risks and threats, and cybersecurity issues, cyber resilience, and more. But the opportunity it creates is massive. So, where do we get started? We all do this through connected APIs. With our experience across multiple sectors, creating tech-enabled customers across BFS, healthcare, telco, retail, and education, we've been able to nail this down into a tried and tested formula for API-led strategy. Why focus on APIs? Simple. It's because APIs are the connecting thread or the fabric of our digital world. And APIs are the underlining foundation for all our digital initiatives. Basically, the future that we talked about is already here. The future is now. So during this webinar, you will hear Aisha talk about Mitra's ACE framework and how we've helped ace your API strategies through our experience across multiple clients. And Nuan, ahead of that, will talk you through what it takes to deliver a modern API. Over to you, Nuan.
All right, thanks, Chinti. So I think that was a brilliant explanation and a visualization of what tomorrow is going to look like. So I'm here to talk you through about what it means to deliver a modern API. So the reason I'm talking about modern APIs is because we are entering into a world of much more decentralized architectures and with new technologies, new programming models, new deployment architectures, and so on. So as Chinti has been explaining over the past few minutes, we see that the entire world is moving towards providing value to our customers. That is our number one priority. Whatever industry you may be from, providing value to your customers is your number one priority, and all the things that we do should be focused primarily based on that. And delivering value to our customers is not as easy as we think. So Microsoft, in a couple of years back, about 7 or 8 years back, did this research called the online experimentation at Microsoft, where they state that the things that we as organizations, as vendors, assume that give value to their customers are 66% of the time a failure. Only roughly about 1/3 of the things that we assume as vendors, as organizations that give value to our customers, succeed. So what does that mean? That means we need to do a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error to see what really works out and what doesn't. So that requires us to be on a platform where we can put out things out in the market fast, see how they are being adopted, see how our clients and customers like it, and make course corrections and adjustments if we seem them not to be working as well as we intended them to. So that's basically why microservices and decentralized decomposed architectures are becoming much more prominent today. So it is true that microservice-based architectures give us much more resilient and robust and easily manageable systems, but it also gives us the value that we want so that we can experiment and try things out fast, deploy our software faster into the market, see how they work out, and expand or course correct based on our observations. So that's basically the fundamental of microarchitectures. And how do APIs fit in? So APIs are the layer that exposes these services to your consumers. So the microservices are basically useless unless you have nicely defined APIs that people can consume to build amazing custom experiences. That's the value of APIs. So what we're going to do next is we are going to take a look at what it takes to deliver an API in modern architectures. So if we go on into the next slide, the first thing that I want to talk about is governance. So when talking about modern architectures, decentralized architectures, and microservices, one of the fundamentals that we keep on discussing is the level of freedom that we give to our engineering teams, to the people building software, with smaller team sizes, with the autonomy that they need to build, to choose their own technologies, to choose the processes that they want, to pick on their practices and deployment architectures that they wish, that they prefer to deploy their services layer, which is a great thing, I think. So that gives us the agility and the flexibility we need as organizations to move fast into the future. However, we should not forget that we as an organization are aligned towards a goal. We want to get all our systems, all our teams aligned towards a common goal. However, and whatever the way our teams are delivering their software pieces, we need to make sure that as an organization, we are all aligned towards the same goal, towards the direction that our organization needs to get at, which is at the end of the day aligned towards giving value to our customers. So if you go on into the next picture, so if you move on into the next slide, you can see here the concept of a control plane and a data plane. So this is where the value of an API management system really plays a critical role in your enterprise architecture. So you can think of the control plane as the layer in your architecture that controls your workloads, and the workloads are basically your services and the API runtimes that lie in this layer called the data plane. So you can think of this like an aircraft, like where the control plane is like the cockpit. The cockpit really doesn't do anything that flies the plane. What flies the plane is actually the engines, the wings and the flaps that take it in the right direction and the right speed, which lie in the data plane. But without the control plane, you can't control where your aircraft is going. You can't control its direction, its speed, or whatever. So this is how an API management system plays a critical role in controlling your APIs, in making sure that your APIs follow the necessary standards in your organization, that you make sure that the necessary security policies are enforced on your APIs, you make sure that the necessary authentication and authorization and approvals are applied on the APIs that are being deployed, and so on and so forth. So the control plane of the API management system, which could include typically the API lifecycle management component, the API design components, the API workflows, and the API portals that are required for the discovery and consumption of the APIs, should be aligned in such a way that they control the data plane or the API workloads that are running in the control in the data plane. This does not mean that these two layers need to be intervened. It needs to be a completely decoupled layers. These two layers need to be completely decoupled from one another, which means that even if your control plane goes down, your workloads can still keep working. There needs to be a very clean and a neat separation between these two, so that you get autonomy, performance, and the scale that you are looking at. The next important thing about delivering APIs, if we move on into the next section, is composability. A modern API is an interface that hides lots of complexities in decentralized and decomposed system. So in the next picture, you will see how an API is composed of various services. So as our teams and our organization build various types of services, for example, services that could be on REST, HTTP, some of our services could be using the gRPC protocol, some could be WebSockets, some could be serverless functions like Lambdas and Google Cloud Functions and so on. Some of our services could be based on event-driven architectures, on message queues, and we may have our data services and so on and so forth. So all this complexity that composes our enterprise architecture, our business capabilities, are nicely composed into APIs. An API is no longer an interface to a simple service. An API is a composable layer. This is where the integration capabilities matter a lot. So when you're deploying a modern API, it's critical that you think about the integration capabilities of that respective API, because the services in the modern world are no longer of a single format or protocol. They are heterogeneous, but you cannot expose all of that complexity into the outside world as is. You need a cleanly defined API layer that composes all of that complexity into a single interface. The next important thing when delivering APIs in today's world, if we move on into the next section, is security. So I'm pretty sure anybody who's familiar with APIs would have heard about OAuth 2 or basic authentication, and so on and so forth. So I categorize API security into three main buckets. So the first is malicious content. So you need to think about how you can prevent consumers from injecting malicious content into their messages. So these could be things like SQL injections, if you're familiar with it. So basically SQL statements that are issued, that are sent in the form of queries and so on through fraudulent applications or attackers that could attempt to steal your data. So you should be worried about how you can scan and filter out messages with malicious content that are hitting your API layer. The second layer is the one that probably most of us are familiar with, which is the identity verification and authorization. So this layer checks whether you have a valid credential. So this is where technologies like OAuth 2, SACML, Open Policy Agent, Scopes, and all the identity verification and authorization systems come into play. So it's very important that you have all of these layers on top of your API, so that you make sure that only the people with the valid credentials and the necessary authorization are allowed into your system. The final one is the trickiest one, which is where attackers come into system with valid credentials and also with valid content, but they've hacked credentials from some place and are pretending to be someone else. So these are frauds and attacks that are pretty tricky to detect. So these kinds of attacks can be detected by continuous learning and pattern identification and observation. For example, if you are getting a token from Sri Lanka right now, and if the same token is being used, let's say a couple of hours later from Australia, that's basically an indication of something's not right. There's no way that a person could have traveled between Sri Lanka and Australia within a matter of 2 hours or so. So those kinds of things have to be identified through systems that observe and monitor the systems for these types of patterns and raise alerts or block systems that may be trying to attack the system in this way. So these are three verticals that are pretty important to consider when you're laying down your API strategy. So if you go on into the next section, the next most important thing about deploying APIs is scale. So we talk a lot nowadays about cloud native architectures and so on. So what does that really mean? What that really means is that, so we've seen organizations moving to the cloud a lot, and also deploying like software for cloud native architectures. So what this really means is that, so when you're consuming cloud resources, you should always be mindful of the cost optimizations and resource utilizations of your system. Now, gone are the days when we did capacity planning for peak workloads and architected our systems for peak workloads. So we only get peaks once in a while, but most of the times our systems run on average. So when we architect our systems for peak, to handle peak, that means we are wasting a lot of resources unnecessarily. So now what we do is we architect systems for average and leave provision for scale. So what does it mean in terms of scale? What are the metrics to look out for when deploying an API strategy? So one is the latency. So as you may have observed from the past few slides, an API API layer adds on an extra layer into your architecture. So you need to be concerned about the latency that it adds into your architecture. It needs to be as minimal as possible. And what it takes to start up new instances of your API and scale. So if you have 3 instances running right now, and if you are getting an increase in load, how fast can you scale up to 10 instances? What's the boot up time like for your API layer? These are things that need to be thought of as well. And independence and isolation. Another important fact when it comes to scale is what dependencies does your API have in order to scale. Now, if it needs you to scale other systems along with your API, then that makes your job harder. For example, if you have to scale your databases, if you have to scale your caching layers, if you have to scale your security layers, just because you have to scale, you're getting an increasing workload. So that doesn't give you the optimal architecture for you to scale up and scale down. So independence and isolation is pretty important. The lesser, the more independent it is, your API layer is, the easier it is going to be for you to scale up and down and run your systems on average workloads. And finally, state replication. So when systems scale, another problem that they have to face is how do you replicate the state of the system into the new nodes that are coming up in your architectures, in your deployments? Does it even need to replicate the state at all? So there are stateless systems as well as stateful systems. Usually there's nothing to be done when you replicate stateless systems, but when it comes to stateful systems, replicating the state is challenging, and you need to have separate solutions for that. So scale is another important fact to be thinking about when deploying your API strategies. So if you move on into the next section, the most important thing about APIs is their availability. So I mentioned in the beginning that providing value to your customers is always your #1 priority. So your customers won't really care whether your services are being hosted on Earth or on Mars. What they really want is that your services are provided to them 100% of the time with no downtime. So it's a very connected world today, and we know what happens when systems go down. So if someone notices something that's not working, someone tweets about it, someone else retweets about it, your system may be up and running in 5 minutes, but the whole world thinks even half an hour later that you're screwed up. So that's how important availability is in the modern world. And since our competition is also fierce, we need to be very mindful about this fact. So how do you cover availability? So you need to think about things like disaster recovery. What happens if your data center goes down? How fast can you bring up your disaster recovery data center? And if you're deploying on the cloud, like if you are on, if you've chosen a particular cloud vendor, have you thought about regional resiliency? Do you have stuff deployed in a different region so that in case one region goes down, can you bring up services fast enough in the other region? And can you route all your traffic into that layer? And even also inter-cloud resiliency. So I've worked with a customer who has a set of WSO2 gateways deployed across Amazon, Azure, and Google. So they go into the depths of IaaS resiliency as well. So in case some service goes down on Amazon for a period of time, they don't have a problem. They just have to rely on the gateways that are on GCP or that are on Azure. So they deploy services in various parts of the world, in various cloud providers as well, for cross-cloud resiliency. The next and final important thing about deploying APIs is insights. So there are 3 types of insights that we need to be worried about when deploying insights. The first is the statistical insights, like about what APIs are being used, what APIs are not being used, what are the ones that I can retire and deprecate, and optimize my resources and maintenance costs and so on. And then the precautionary type of insights that basically capture the state of APIs. Are they working well? Are my customers receiving continuous errors? What is my success rate? What does the response time look like? Are they fast enough? And so on. And the third and most important type of insights for as a business are the business insight that we gather through our APIs. So these are the things that basically help us to make business decisions. So as I said in the beginning, or our aim should be aligned towards giving value to our customers. And we need ways of measuring what that value is, and also using the insights from our system to see whether the insights that we are getting are aligned towards the goal of towards the goal that we have jotted down, towards the direction that we want to get to. We have to make sure that the business insights that we capture, such as like the type of people who are using our APIs, the type of devices they are using, the regions that that are coming up, are they all aligned towards our expectations? And if they are not aligned, if we are seeing a different story from the insights that we gather through our APIs, that probably says that the actions that we have taken are not aligned with the business goals that we want to achieve. So these are the third type of insights that you can gather through APIs to measure whether your business is headed towards the direction that you want it to. So that concludes my short session about what you need to think about in terms of deploying an API strategy in today's context. So next we will be running a quick poll to see what types of problems that you have been facing when deploying your API strategies in your organizations. So you should see a poll on your screens now, asking you what your main areas of interest are. So it would be great if you could respond saying what type of problems that you have faced mostly when trying to deploy an API strategy. Is it the fact that you need governance on your APIs and you are seeing a lack of governance capabilities when deploying your API strategies? Or is it that or composability? Are you finding it hard to compose your services into APIs and expose them over clean interfaces? Is it security? Are you lost or worried about the security that might get impacted by exposing your services too much or too less to the outside world? Are you finding it hard to get the insights from the APIs that are being deployed? Are you finding it hard to trace your requests and the messages that are being passed on? Are you finding it hard to convert your insights into business knowledge? And finally, are you worried about or finding it hard to make your systems scale and available all of the time? Are you finding it hard to do regional deployments to scale your system into newer regions of the world for resiliency and scale, of course? Are you finding problems in these areas? So if you could answer these, we could take a quick look at the type of problems that you are facing to get a better understanding of the landscape we're dealing with.
Okay, looks like we've quite a few respondents. We'll give everybody maybe a few more seconds to 17 seconds to respond. In the meantime, I'd like also the participants, based on that was a great session, Nuwan, thank you very much for that. But if any of the participants have any questions, please feel free to start jotting down the questions so that we can start reviewing it at the end of the speaker sessions. Shall we go into seeing the results?
Okay, so it looks like there are people who are thinking about security a lot and are worried about how to secure their APIs. So, which is kind of like the trend that we are seeing as well, because security is always a challenging domain, and it's an ever expanding domain as well. So the probability of being on top of the game of security is quite challenging, and that is why we have newer technologies always coming up every day based on the newer vectors of security that we want to address. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Ayesha to conduct the rest of the session.
So I'm not too sure if some of the attendees saw the poll results. Maybe that might be a technical issue, but I want to just read out the numbers. Governance was at 40%, composability was at 53%, security at 67%. So, Nuan, you're right, that is the highest concern or challenge. Insights at 47%, a little surprising. I think as people sort of understand that data means money, I think this might increase a lot more. And scalability and availability hit the big time, 87% in the poll results. So that was the highest. I'm not too sure. I apologize for the technical challenge. I'm not too sure if all the attendees are able to see the poll results. All right. So with that,
All right.
why don't we move on to your section?
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. So I hope you guys are enjoying our session in terms of what it takes to design a modern API. And we spoke about it briefly in terms of how do we essentially capture the ROI, measure the returns from an API-led connectivity approach. So at Mitra, we really like to think about it as how do you ace your API strategy? So we have developed the ACE model to capture key outcomes and quantify a digital transformation project that revolves specifically around a hyper-connected world and unified customer experience. So let's walk you through what we consider the ACE in your API strategy, right? So the A in your ACE, which is your adopt, is how essentially do you ensure adoption of APIs. We spoke briefly about insights that talks about the usage of these APIs, where are your customers coming from, and so on. So we'll talk about each of these in further detail. The C in your adopt framework is about the connectivity of APIs between the things that we spoke about, right? So the IoT, the connected devices, your connected cars, your mobile phones, all these things, and the people using them. Finally, we spoke about the E in experience in acing your API strategy. And this is about what experience these APIs can provide and enhance for the user journey and ecosystem as a whole. So taking this further, what I'd really like to take our listeners through is essentially real life examples. Now, we spoke about how we design a modern API. We are going to take some customer use cases and showcase how we involve governance, composability, and security, and measure it with our ACE model. So at this point, I'd like to share some of our key learnings in our engagements. So we've done a lot of consulting projects. We've designed, developed, supported, and maintained many IT solutions across various industries and geographies. So with that, I'd like us to take a look into the adopt in an API-led solution. So interestingly, only 8% of digital initiatives have shown returns in revenue from a specific API project. Now, this number is actually from the 2018 State of API Integration Report, and that reports on a global outlook. And as we find continued growth in API adoption across the globe and the upcoming trends in an API-led connectivity and hyperconnected world, we've observed that this report suggested that 4,500 integrations were developed over 200,000 plus days of developer effort across 27 industries. So this is interesting because this is the average of 400 businesses with revenues ranging from 100K to 25 billion. So when we really think about this, for a large enterprise, this investment and throughput of API interfaces and integrations are offset by the revenue coming from existing operations. But for smaller organizations, this becomes more challenging, frankly, too expensive. Hence, the number that we see here, which is that only 8% showcase revenue from an API program. So if the revenue outset is so small, or reported as it being so small, how then do you foolproof your digital transformation strategy? So we touched upon this in terms of how to design a modern API. We spoke about elements such as security, scaling, availability, and insights. So what we really need to think about is how do we promote adoption of APIs and microservices more and reduce time to market and developer effort so that in the long term, your revenue is actually offset and you see better numbers growing here. So to talk about this further, when you think about adoption, you need to think again of three facets once more. So we want to talk about developer experience, API ops, and API-led design. So I think most of us are familiar with user experience. It's one of the top priorities for many consumer-facing companies. This ability to simplify complex interactions into meaningful experiences for users is equally important and a competitive edge for many companies, and hence there's a lot of focus driving user experience. But how many people, when they go into a digital transformation project, how many businesses focus on the developer experience? Because it is as important to think about how developers feel during the use of an API. It is important only because your time to market is crucial and you need to get that competitive edge as well. So developer experience in our mind is really the accumulation of all experience that developers have when they develop an API. This is typically not a main concern during a creation of a product aimed towards developers, but it's important that we keep this in focus. And then we talk about API ops, which essentially is a new breed of DevOps. It supports developer-friendly and business-oriented APIs. So this is really moving into the next level of how do you want to build an environment where testing, building, releasing software is rapid and also reliable. In 2020, the movement of API ops will become more apparent. So API development, API operations will encompass the same culture and movement as DevOps. And it is important when we take a digital transformation project that we put ample focus into the developer experience, how you support all your environments before you initiate any of your other projects. And then finally, we move into API design. I spoke about, composability. We spoke about governance and so on. It's also important, together with security, to think about how we provide more expressiveness and capability to your APIs. So now we see trends such as GraphQL over REST. We talk about open APIs and async APIs for tooling designs. And we also touched briefly about OAuth and OpenID Connect for security. But these are some of the trends that we see will ensure that you have good adoption in your API strategy. So let's take this through an example. So what I'd like us to consider is like a real world example of an implementation we have done at Mitra to explain in further detail what this ACE strategy really means. So keep in mind, the first part of the speaker sessions was about how you design a modern API, and the ACE is talking about how do you measure what you have designed, right? So we're talking about how do you essentially ensure that there is a good adoption of the APIs that you have suggested and that your ROIs are paying off, right? So we will start initially with an example in the telco industry. So with 9.3 billion mobile connections and increased penetration globally, I thought the telco use case would be interesting. So I'll talk you through a deployment that we did at Cambodia, essentially, where the ask was to revamp the entire customer engagement with a decided focus on attracting and engaging millennials. And interestingly, this was specifically Gen Z, who have an attention time period of just 8 seconds. So if you want to provide customer engagement solutions within 8 seconds of an attention span, your API strategy better be really good, right? So this needs to encompass C2B use cases, B2C, B2B, and so on, right? So the challenge from a technical perspective for this Cambodian MNO was essentially to revamp all of their customer engagement layer. So we initially broke it down into a first phase, which was the design of an intuitive self-service app, which needed to be highly scalable, available, and resilient. Again, remember, attention span of 8 seconds. So moving on, the solution came in the form of essentially a digital enablement platform that focuses on customer communication and experience through APIs. The APIs were used as a single point across your content management system and your digital layer as well. So whether it was your iOS, Android platforms, any of that, the API was essentially the composing factor which hid all the complexity behind it, but provided the seamless user experience. So let's move into some of the benefits. So with this deployment in Cambodia, we were able to deploy to 3 million users within the first week of deployment to the Play Store and the marketplace. And we had 500,000 user base growth targeted per year. And we were able to deploy 100 plus APIs in terms of, integrations that focus on customer experience. And this was 300 plus transactions per second that was to be used on this platform. So in kind of putting all of this together, we'll go into the outcomes that I'd like to share. So if you're really thinking about adopting in a real world experience, what is important, like we said, is to really understand how do you shorten your life cycle and time to market. So what is good to know is that at Mitra, we've been able to showcase all of this experience into maturity model. So essentially, how do you include your DevOps? How do you include your IP ops? How do you include your maturity in terms of the cloud platforms that you're deploying into? So we have a maturity model which can help assess and create the right strategy for you. And the next thing that we want to really think about is when you talk about adoption, it cannot be taken just in the case of an API product or an API solution. It has to be in conjunction with all the gateways, the connection for the experience as well. So whether it's React Native technology or hybrid mobile technology that you're using, it has to go hand in hand and be complementary as well. All right, so that kind of talks us through the adoption. Now, similar to the adoption use case, now what I'd like to take you through is the next one in ensuring your API strategy is aced, which is the connection facet. So when we move on to how you connect your APIs between partners, things, and the people using them, I'd like to bring your attention to some interesting statistics. So 50% of all B2B collaboration takes place via API integrations, and majority of businesses agree that at least a quarter of the user base will upgrade or renew their digital platform if they offer integrations. So if they offer integrations, then what's the secret sauce to connecting right? So businesses need APIs that are built to have flexibility and obviously longevity to create a customer-centric and ecosystem-driven platform. So the answer is really to connect with an ecosystem and cross-industry convergence mindset. So you inculcate API security design and API analytics from the get-go. So from the elements that we spoke about in terms of designing your modern API, we want to focus on API security and API analytics. So why we want to do this is, we want to understand how we leverage the best of API trends and transformations to stay competitive and relevant to your business. Again, to illustrate this, so we spoke about ecosystem-driven platforms, security design and analytics. And to take this further, what I'd like to run through essentially is another case study to better highlight what API connectivity means. So in this case, we will take an example of the banking industry. So, we've seen a lot of convergence in banking because as a lot of folks go for financial independence and so on, there's a lot of reasons why banks now start looking at partnerships. So while we consider this as an ecosystem-driven platform, we need to keep in mind that this ecosystem changes, and as it changes, you need to be able to scale quickly. So the ecosystem supported by APIs must be able to adapt to a diverse pool of industries and their varying requirements. So what this means really, I'll take you through an example of a state bank in Asia, in Vietnam really, which has multiple branches, and their aspiration was to create a new growth engine by partnering with fintechs and embracing e-wallets and digital payments. So essentially, to do this, what was important is that you need to identify all potential requirements that opens the doors for different APIs to be bundled together, right? So what it could mean is that a specific ecosystem, we spoke about security. So imagine the use case of a cross-border remittance where now you're opening up your banking ecosystem to send money overseas from your bank account. So if you're sending money constantly, way below your balance, way below your own financial security, that is something the bank needs to check, against for fraudulent activity, who has access to this. And when we talk about digital payments, again, we need to think about, in the case of e-commerce, how can we validate that this is the same account owner who is now paying for a product that is purchased from the States in Vietnam. So those are the elements of security that comes in when you think about an ecosystem-driven platform for banks. So I'll take you through the solution that we provided for this particular bank. We had to develop an intuitive platform that focused especially on quick partner onboarding. So this meant that your API strategies had to be in place with automated workflows, and these automated workflows had to essentially have API analytics and security embedded into it. So let's take a look at what we were able to achieve with this particular solution. So we were able to support 5 million online users with mobile banking off the bat. As soon as we went live, this was an e-wallet solution connecting multiple digital platforms together. So this was all the e-wallets and fintechs across Vietnam. The state bank was able to, immediately provide access to 5 million mobile banking users. And this is, 1,000 plus APIs, and the roadmap is only growing. So to illustrate what learnings we took away from this, it's important again to go back into security and enhance customer experience, right? So how do you essentially manage in your connectivity, your customer experience layer is something that's very important. So our recommendation is that your customer experience is mapped to your API design. The next thing we want to think about is security and digital trust, which we spoke about in great detail. And finally, with your API analytics, now comes the ability for you to start making revenue from the API usage, right? Now, in this example, we're getting a lot of insight about how many, say, customer non-performing loan behavior and credit behavior can be done because we're monitoring the entire payment ecosystem. All right, so let's finally move into the experience in adopting, connecting, and experience in your ACE strategy. So really to take a look at the unified experience in a hyper-connected world, let's go into a couple of statistics very quickly. So 64% of businesses report offering customized integration with multiple customer touchpoints leads to more revenue and customer stickiness. So this is 38 billion connected things by 2020. Developing an API strategy that integrates with IoT and wearable devices is something that you need to think about for this kind of use case. So to illustrate this again, what we have broken it down is into APIs that has artificial intelligence built into it inherently, traceability, and the ability to have real-time message processing within your API layer. So to talk about this, again, I'll go through a real-life example with a health tech case study. So the Australian healthcare system faced disruption with the introduction of the NDIS scheme, right, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, whereby primary care providers for people with disabilities, their support network, and individual caregivers and rehabilitation centers were now all interconnected. So what we really wanted to do is help promote people back into a workplace and an inclusive society. So we wanted to tackle social isolation, promote well-being, and assist decision-making with better informed decisions about care in conjunction with family, friends, and caregivers. Now, to provide an insurance scheme for the folks with disabilities and their welfare providers and their community groups. The solution came in the form essentially of a scalable platform, again, an API platform that provided seamless integration and connectivity with AI inbuilt into it. So to take you through the solution, we were able to launch a connected experience, an end-to-end connected insurance solution, and which became within the top 5 of health tech mobile apps within the marketplace very soon. And we have right now around 100,000 users, and it's constantly growing. So it's very interesting to see how, when we amalgate our learnings, real-time intelligence is of key to solutions like this, where we have streams of Fitbit information coming in, our sleep patterns are drawing in on a regular basis. We know when there is a fall, when there is a missed medication, and so on. So this intelligence and monitoring is something that's very important when you look at health tech solutions. And in order to do that with your convergent ecosystem across multiple industries, multiple things, multiple people, it's important that you, again, ensure that your API analytics is on point. All right, so that kind of is our key learnings in acing your API strategy. I hope you found that very interesting. I think we have time now, Chinti, to go for maybe another question from the audience.
Yeah, before we go to the question, I think we have one more poll that we'd like to ask our listeners. So let's go ahead and publish that. And hopefully this time we won't have any technical issues reading its results. So I would like to basically ask, what have your pain points been in adopting an API-led strategy? Has it been the lack of design and poor usability, or was it the fact that there wasn't a strategy really, and you've sort of got into the journey of building your APIs? Or is it difficult to monitor and govern your API lifecycle? Or is it the fact that you don't have the right kind of skills? This we've seen quite often as well. Is it the fact that you need to have greater DevOps maturity that goes hand in hand with a strong API strategy? So we are going to give you a few more seconds to perhaps answer this question. And while we wait, let me remind you again that you're welcome to post any questions. We're going into Q&A next, and we will have about 7 minutes or so for the Q&A. So please go ahead, and once you answer this poll question, let's go ahead and start looking at your questions. How are we doing on the poll? Okay, we'll give it a few more seconds to allow the opportunity for all our listeners to put in your answer. All right, let's close the poll. Looks like we've got a majority of the answers in, and hopefully we'll get the yay. Okay, fantastic. So looks like, as expected, we ran a similar webinar a few weeks back and as well, and I think this is a similar results. A lot of you feel that you need to increase your DevOps maturity, followed by having a lot of not having proper design and reusability. So what's really great is that if we go on to the next slide, before we take on questions, we would be following this on with an offer that you should really sign up for. It's a 1-hour deep dive to assess your API strategy using our ACE framework, which also includes leverage of DevOps and looking at how you're designing your APIs, looking at ways to optimize technical debt, as an example, as well as a WSO2 architecture review for agility. So there are 2 offers that we will be sending along to all of our participants today. All right. Sounds like we have a few questions coming in. The first one's really easy, so I'm going to take that. One is, would we have this webinar available for later? The answer is yes. All of you who participated will get a recording along with the opportunity to register for this deep dive session or the review of your architecture. The next one, I think this might be for you, Nuan. Are there any free analytics is the question from our listeners.
Free analytics, so like I'm not exactly sure what the question is asking about, but to give you an overview of the WSO2 products. So our products are, yes, free and open source to use, and so if you get API Manager, you can also get the analytics component that comes with it. And yes, so analytics, just like the rest of our products, comes for free as well. And you can also integrate our solutions with other. There are lots of free and open source analytics solutions as well, based on what you want to analyze, like things like, Splunk, Grafana, Prometheus, Grafana, Jaeger, Zipkin, and so on for operational analytics. So yeah, there are various free and open source tools as well.
Okay, excellent. And I think that was what you were sharing also around the insights that you could gather as well, correct?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we have a few more questions coming up. What are WSO2's API Manager's 3.0 features? Maybe you can sort of briefly go through that, Nuan.
Yeah, so to give a quick cap of that, so API Manager 3.0 is a major release from version 2. So we've done a major UI revamp on it. So the user interfaces, the experiences are completely different. We modernized the UIs and also the configuration model. So the configs are also moved into a different format, and we have a single config file. On top of that, we released the Kubernetes operator for APIs. So we are the first in the world to introduce and operate on Kubernetes for APIs, which basically makes it super simple to deploy API on Kubernetes, unlike any that has been introduced before. We've introduced something called API products, which is a way of combining API resources into reusable products that can be consumed by applications. And also we've introduced GraphQL based APIs. So the platform now gives you capability to apply security rate limits and the standard API management functionality for your GraphQL operations. We've done enhancements to support monetization of APIs better. So we integrate with Stripe out of the box now, and we have capabilities where you can get invoices for your APIs and so on. And we've also brought in additional security capabilities, like the machine AI-based security for APIs, API keys, and basic authentication on top of the standard OAuth 2 stuff and mutual TLS stuff that we've been having. And also we introduced a capability called honeypots, which is again a capability that allows to capture people that might be doing port scans on your gateways and identify those attackers as well. So yeah, right on the top of my head, those are the main functionalities we've added in the new version.
Excellent. Thanks, Nuan, for that. Maybe the next one, Ayesha, you can take on. How quickly can a potential partner integrate into its services?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Now, each industry and vertical obviously has a different objective when they partner with cross-industry solutions. So if it is a bank partnering with an insurance provider, or whether it's a bank now enabling e-commerce payment, each of these partnerships pose a different set of objectives and solutions. And obviously when we take multiple different industries, these vary. So the easy reply is there is no one answer into how quickly you can take to integrate it. But really what it means is when you think about an API-led strategy and with an API product and platform that is mature, that enables a gateway and an external kind of approach, an external gateway to interconnect all of these convergence industries, then you can automate a lot of these partner onboarding processes after your first integration is put in place. So Chinti, I think, easy answer is you can't say it very quickly, but if you followed some of the case studies that we spoke about, we went and we were able to deploy and go to market with multiple partners within periods ranging from 8 weeks to 3 months.
Perfect. And right on time, that's all the time we have allocated for this webinar. I really like to thank every one of you for participating. There's quite a few questions coming in, but let's keep the conversation going. Please feel to email us through the registered link if you have any further questions. Thank you very much for the presenters as well as all of our listeners. I hope this was a great learning session. Thank you.